Brooklyn Heights was New York's first historic landmark district. Its quiet streets and lush gardens feel like a quaint Victorian neighborhood where time has stood still. That's a bit misleading. What the streets don't let on is that they have a wild side, an underground history of tenements, bars, immigrants, workers, artists, eccentrics, and a famous burlesque queen. The Heights stretches roughly from the Brooklyn Bridge down to Atlantic Avenue, and from the riverfront over to Cadman Plaza West and Court Street. For much of the 1800s, it was a wealthy and exclusive suburb. One of its most handsome buildings preserves that era inside and out, the home of the Brooklyn Historical Society.
The building was built in 1881 by George B. Post, who was best known actually as the architect of the New York Stock Exchange. He was inspired by this kind of wonderful combination of very Victorian 19th century architecture, and he was also very interested in fairly modern engineering, and in fact he was inspired by the building of the Brooklyn Bridge that was going on right next door. If you look carefully, what you'll discover is that there's a steel structure underneath all of this wood.
Oh, no kidding.
The upper floors of the building actually hang, they're suspended from above.
Like the Brooklyn Bridge.
Like the Brooklyn Bridge.
Oh. With the opening of the bridge in 1883 and the first subways in the 1900s, the Heights era of exclusivity ended. Its streets filled up with factories, storage facilities, and tenement housing for workers. Because of this, the neighborhood became attractive and affordable to artists and bohemians. A lot of history has been saved in Brooklyn Heights, but also a lot has been erased, especially that underground history of its arty bohemian side. For instance, this building where I'm standing is where its first and most famous bohemian, Walt Whitman, printed the first edition of his Leaves of Grass in 1855. Why, what have you thought of yourself? Is it you, then, that thought yourself less? Is it you that thought the president greater than you? Or the rich better off than you? Or the educated wiser than you? Because you were greasy or pimpled, or were once drunk? Or that you are no scholar and never saw your name in print? Do you give in that you are any less immortal? Frank Santos, son of an immigrant Spanish cabinet maker, grew up in a 16-family tenement house in the Heights. So, Frank, when you were growing up, what was this block of Dick Street like?
Well, this was all stores.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So,
this was a grocery store. That was a bakery, coffee shop,
next one?
shoemaker shop.
Wow.
Yeah.
The next one?
The next one was a vegetable store. They used to have a big horse and a little pony with wagons, and they used to go around the neighborhood.
So they bring them up here, load them up, and take them?
Load them up, and then they go around the neighborhood and sell the produce.
Mr. Santos went to school next to the Peaks Mason Mince Factory on Midaw Street.
When we used to come out of school, at break time, we used to stand out in the schoolyard, and the people used to throw candy down at us. We'd stay there and catch candy. There's not many of us left. There's maybe 3 or 4 of us left, you know, the old timers, you know.
In the 1940s, city planner Robert Moses declared Brooklyn Heights a slum. He proposed to clear it by building the new Brooklyn-Queens Expressway straight up through the middle of it. Homeowners fought that plan and won an ingenious compromise. In the late 40s into the early 50s, the expressway was built in 2 tiers along the cliff face, with the pedestrian esplanade or promenade up above it. Still, many blocks of factories and tenements were demolished.
The house is right here.
So it was all tenements around here?
All tenements. This section of the BQE was opened around 1955.
What effect did it have on the neighborhood?
Oh, it ruined the neighborhood. It ruined the neighborhood.
Also torn down for the BQE was a big house at number 7 Midaw Street. In 1940, a remarkable group of artists and eccentrics lived and partied there. They included the poet W.H. Auden, the novelist Carson McCullers, the writers Paul and Jane Bowles, the composer Benjamin Britten, and the stripper and would-be novelist Gypsy Rose Lee. But they were far from the only artists and writers in the Heights around that period. Norman Mailer had a walk-up at 142 Columbia Heights until his death in 2007. Truman Capote lived in a basement apartment at 70 Willow Street from the 1950s into the 60s, where he wrote Breakfast at Tiffany's and In Cold Blood. Arthur Miller lived in several places in the Heights. He set Willie Loman's adulterous affair in Death of a Salesman in the Standish Arms Hotel on Columbia Place. It was also the fictional home of Clark Kent. In the 1970s, the waterfront below Brooklyn Heights was still a working cargo port. The carload of drugs unloaded there in the 1971 film The French Connection showed how that cargo wasn't always legal. Jim Schmidt, who's lived in the Heights since the 1970s, remembers a similar scene from real life.
At the time I was working for South Street Seaport Museum right across the river, and we used to watch the ships come in and out of here, especially in the evenings. We'd be running concerts on the piers, and it wasn't DEA yet, it was the Customs Department. Used to send agents out to our piers at night to set up high-powered night vision binoculars and watch the freighters. One night we were watching, a little motorboat comes around with a man in scuba gear in it. The ship is docked in this slip over here. The guy goes over the side. So we're watching this orange glow under the water. We say to the customs guys, "What is that?" This is the trick they do. They take a suitcase-sized steel box, stuff it with cocaine, spot weld it to the hull underwater, 2 or 3 feet below the water line. When it gets in here, they go down, they cut it out, bring it up.
So guys down there, a frogman is down there cutting it
down
loose?
there with an acetylene torch, cutting out the spot welds. By the time he brought it up, there were 10 helicopters. There were cars racing onto the pier here.
The Heights has been cleaned up a lot since then, but it still retains some of its wilder side. Painter Joe Coleman lives with his wife Whitney Ward on Montague Street in what he calls the Auditorium.
It's their place, you know. It's like we're just the guests. Yeah, but it's their place. They own it.
He left the East Village 14 years ago.
The reason why I know that it was 1994 is because it was the date that I did the painting, The Glory That Was Once New York. My art, you know, who even knows what that term means anymore, art, you know. It's what I do, you know, and it's what I really love. I need it like food. And I work with jeweler's lenses and a one-hair brush. It takes me 8 hours a day just to work on like a square inch of just like caressing the surface over and over again. You look at the painting from a distance and you get some idea, but the closer you look and each little detail in the painting, there's a million stories within stories within stories within stories. It's a world within a world within a world.
Today, Brooklyn Heights has visibly reclaimed its more genteel past and has bloomed again as a safe, quiet suburb. Its underground history is a little harder to see, but you can still hear it in its stories.